Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I think as a courtesy towards all those that have joined on time, I'm going to start saying my greetings slowly to give those that are not yet here time to join. Thank you so much all for joining this webinar today, and a special warm welcome to our SwissCham members, both locally and in Switzerland, guests of the Embassy of Switzerland, clients of the Centre for Risk Analysis, as well as members from other European chambers. It's such an honor to have you all join us today. I'm Eve Ralphs from SwissCham, the Swiss Chamber of Commerce in Johannesburg. Let me start off with a really big thank you to the Centre for Risk Analysis, who agreed to put together this review of the BRICS Summit for us at such short notice. And we really very much look forward to hearing their transparent assessment on this much debated event. And I'm pleased to welcome back Chris Hattingh, Head of Policy Analysis at the CRA, who I'm convinced needs no further introduction to our audience today, as he is prominently visible in broadcast, digital and written media, and both him and Dr. John Endres and the entire CRA team, for that matter, are highly valued partners of SwissChams. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules, please. We're quite a sizable group today, so if I may ask you to please keep your microphones and cameras off at all times. Chris will take us through his presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A session. Please write your questions in the chat box, and we'll go through as many as possible after Chris's talk. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be sent to all registrants of today's webinar. Dear Chris, and by extension your CRA team, who I know are supporting you in the background, welcome. Thank you for allowing us to host you. And over to you.
Good morning, Evelyn. Thank you very much to you, to SwissCham, for the opportunity this morning. Thank you for the invitation to us to get a briefing together on the BRICS Summit, on some of the most interesting takeaways and some of the implications going forward. So thank you very much for pushing us in that regard. And good morning to all of you who are taking time to be with us on the webinar this morning. We look forward to discussing the BRICS Summit with you, what we see as some of the key takeaways, what are the implications, especially for South Africa, some of the deals around announced as part of the BRICS Summit. Let's see what we can take from that. Just to give you an idea of our title for this morning's briefing and our imagery that we're using, focusing on the seismic potential of BRICS. So the expanded BRICS now from the 1st of January 2024, we see the potential for the tectonic plates of the countries that make part of the new BRICS could bring about significant economic change in the medium to long term. On the other side, it could also bring about more tension between the partner countries that are involved in BRICS. How these various things shake out could determine the very future of the entity itself, and could potentially mean that BRICS becomes more significant than entities like the G7. But we want to highlight for you the potential strengths of BRICS as well as the potential fault lines. Just to give you a bit of an idea of the overview for today for our different sections, we'll start with the background. We'll compare some data for BRICS, but also for the G7 countries. We'll look at geopolitical tensions and volatility. We'll move to the risks and opportunities for South Africa. And then finally, we'll give you a few key takeaways and possible scenarios for the entity that is BRICS. To start off with the background, a little bit of basic history, as we now had the 15th iteration of the BRICS Summit recently in Johannesburg. The members of BRICS, of course, invited, as well as a number of those who expressed their interest in joining BRICS, as well as many African countries also invited, as you see the Ramaphosa administration trying to take a bit of a lead on the continued economic integration of Africa, especially with the focus on something like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Bit of history on BRICS itself. In 2001, you had the term of BRICS coined by an economist, Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs. In 2009, you had the first annual BRIC summit hosted in Yekaterinburg in Russia. Then you had in 2010, where South Africa was invited to join Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in 2014, a very significant development, the BRICS Development Bank was established, that has subsequently been renamed to the New Development Bank. BRICS itself, not a formal agreement, not something like NATO, for example, a military defensive alliance, a more looser alliance partnership. There's no formal membership structure, no terms in terms of what you need to adhere to be included in BRICS. So it's more of a concept up until this point. But as we've seen in the latest summit, perhaps now a bit more of a focus on what could the entity of BRICS actually do? What could it mean in terms of being a member of BRICS? What does that give you? What are your requirements as a member of BRICS? Perhaps now the opportunity for the BRICS entity to start implementing these sorts of deliverables, transparent goals, deadlines, all that sort of thing. A sort of meta point just to keep in mind, as BRICS was formed, the term was coined, the countries that formed part of the entity started taking various actions to try and act in a bit more coherent economic and diplomatic sense. You largely had the bipolar world in terms of geopolitics during the Cold War, the US and the USSR, the Soviet Union. Then you had the unipolar moment of United States dominance in terms of economics, but also geopolitics and diplomacy. And now the question becomes, are we entering perhaps a multipolar moment where it's not just a case of two blocks opposed to each other, in the case of the US and China, but could there be other blocks that play an important role in terms of pragmatic economic decisions? Again, there's the opportunity for BRICS to take a leading role in this regard. But on the other hand, the risk side, where in terms of geopolitical tensions between BRICS members themselves, the entity itself could simply fall by the wayside, and the US and China will continue to lead in terms of geopolitical developments. Looking at the members then themselves, the BRICS Plus, as I've termed it, a few others have used this term, not sort of official definition from the BRICS declaration side. From the summit, they're going to keep the BRICS name and the acronym. They're not going to keep adding new letters for each new country that joins. That's a challenge for those of us who want to engage in playing around with acronyms. But for now, I'm just going to use the term BRICS Plus. So from the 1st of January next year, you will have Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates joining the BRICS partnership. Just to map that for you, our source here from Bloomberg, so you can see in terms of geography, the current members in light blue and the new invited members in yellow. You can see very much the focus in the Middle East and Eurasia becoming a great focus there in terms of expanding scope. I was quite surprised that a country like Indonesia that they weren't invited to join, given their massive economic growth that is forecast, and especially investment in renewable energy and that kind of thing. And also a country like Nigeria in terms of its economic growth. Instead, the BRICS members going for the option of admitting Ethiopia, that in and of itself brings its own strengths, but also massive challenges with some of the local conflicts currently happening in Ethiopia. But I think South Africa especially wanted more African representation in BRICS, so they pushed then for Ethiopia. The inclusion of Argentina, interesting there, more Latin American representation, but Argentina brings its own financial issues, especially in terms of debt and the debt burden that country is dealing with. Can something like the New Development Bank help Argentina navigate some of its financial constraints in the short to medium term? If we move to our next section, then comparing BRICS and the G7 countries, if you firstly look at BRICS and the G7 as a percentage of the world population from 2010 to 2011, you can see over time then, as the graph fills up for us, as we see over time how much the orange share, the orange bars that represents BRICS, how that share of world population has grown over time. So in terms of pure population heft, and that's sort of the idea of demographics, how much BRICS representation is important for that. That is, of course, not deterministic of economic growth. It is by no means a guarantee if one has a large population that you're going to see more economic growth, more investment, more quality of life improvements. But now, and as well as the inclusion of the new members in BRICS, you're seeing massively how they are representative of world population, and how the G7 countries have remained somewhat consistent. This trend could likely continue, especially with the growth of India. But on the other hand, you've got the decline of a country like China, which as a result of the so-called one-child policy is potentially entering into issues around demographics, and older population, younger people under a lot of strain economically, living with their parents, not necessarily able to grow families. So there are counterbalancing considerations. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE with large immigrant populations, if those populations, for example, move away, you could see them decline. But then you have countries like South Africa and Ethiopia, especially on the African continent, which will likely have the most population growth over the next century. They could continue to boost that share that BRICS has of the world population. If you look at BRICS and G7 GDP, again from 2010 to 2022, you can see how the BRICS share has always been very large and has been growing over time, and has been largely boosted by a country like China, again contributing massively to world economic growth, world GDP, but also to the BRICS members, especially taking off quite a bit since 2020. A country like India, I think, is going to be very important in this regard, as economic growth in China looks to be moderating somewhat, maybe between 3% and 5%, which for us in South Africa would still be incredible, but by Chinese standards of the last 20 years would not be that incredibly high. Perhaps China can reform some of its own economic policies and constraints, but countries like India, I think, are going to take the lead in pushing this share of world GDP. You can compare that with the G7 countries, which started on a much higher base on average than the BRICS countries. People on average are richer in the G7 countries, citizens in those countries, and how that has fluctuated at times, but still remains quite high over the medium to long term. Into 2022, for our latest available data, quite a bit higher than our BRICS numbers. But again, here you see the trend, at least for BRICS, is on the up, as well as for the G7. Hopefully, with economic growth taking off in some regions, we'll see world GDP continue to increase. Comparing BRICS and G7 GDP per capita then, so for people in terms of their quality of life, their spending power, you can see firstly for our BRICS countries, our BRICS plus, how on average GDP per capita remains quite low at the latest time of available data in 2021 versus your G7 countries, which on average citizens are simply more economically well off. A lot of scope and opportunity here for the BRICS countries to arrest the current challenges and situation that they face. Can they become a more coherent bloc in terms of implementing policies that promote economic growth and improvement of quality of life? We could get to something representing G7 levels. But for the time being, just in terms of pure spending power and quality of life, the G7 countries remain quite far ahead. Looking at the question of a BRICS currency, this was widely discussed leading up into the latest BRICS Summit. We did not have any declarative statements around a BRICS currency. There is a desire, I think, among some BRICS members, especially Russia and China, to implement some sort of challenger to the US dollar, especially. I think this represents massive complexities and challenges. But to just give you an overview of the potential of a BRICS currency, you've got many variations in policy deployment, in GDP generation, in currency management, and also in interest rates and inflation policies between BRICS countries. These sorts of challenges make it very difficult for you to devise and promote, as it were, and establish a common currency. The required level of complexity of integration would be exceedingly complex. And also, I think a better avenue for BRICS countries, instead of focusing just on a BRICS currency, as it were, would be to increase trade in their respective currencies between BRICS members. That could ensure maybe more long-term stability of those currencies, again, depending on them managing their own fiscal houses, as it were. Finally, you could also implement a payment system to facilitate digital cross-country local currency payments. I also want to talk about a BRICS currency, and the caveat of the sort of low-hanging fruit at the moment for a BRICS currency would be the Chinese yuan. That is the fastest growing alternative currency to the dollar. It could be the best alternative for BRICS countries if they then want to use an alternative currency. So I don't think we should discount what could be behind the push for a BRICS currency, which could open the door for more countries to become reliant on and use the Chinese currency. This could be a way for the Chinese government to extend their influence in terms of the spending power and ability of the Chinese currency itself through saying that we want to establish a competitor to the US dollar. That could be one part of the narrative, and it could very well be the main motivation, but it also then comes with a benefit for the Chinese government to extend the use of its currency globally. A little bit more just on the dollar and partly why its power continues to remain so strong. You've got three sort of pillars, as it were, that the dollar derives its power from in terms of valuations, liquid transactional settlements, and also that it is a safe institutional asset for investing. Can a BRICS currency come to represent these pillars and represent then that sort of challenge to a US dollar? In 2022, the dollar accounted for 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. The US itself then involved in about 90% of global foreign exchange transactions. The euro was in second place at 20%, and the Chinese yuan between 2 and 4%. There for you, the Chinese yuan or renminbi accounts for 2.7% of foreign exchange reserves. So still very low. That doesn't mean the potential is there for growth. But I also don't necessarily want to take it as a given that all the BRICS partners want to become overly reliant just on the Chinese yuan instead of maybe just using the US dollar. I don't think it's a given that that sort of thing will happen. Only the European Union has ever achieved a monetary union, and that was also at the cost of recurring near-death experiences. Are the BRICS countries willing to potentially take on those risks as well? It's all well and good to have the rhetoric of a BRICS currency, but then you need to take on the risks of a common currency as well. With a country like Argentina, Iran, with the fiscal challenges that they face, do countries like South Africa, India, Brazil want to peg their fortunes of their currencies to the currencies of those other countries? I think that bar of proof is quite high. Final point on the potential BRICS currency, I think a better focus for the BRICS members could be really utilizing and capacitating the use of the new development bank. It itself is aiming to increase the share of funding it raises in local currencies to 30%, where it's currently at less than 20%. At the turn of the century, the dollar constituted 72% of the world's currency reserves, today at 56%. So despite the challenges, there could be a trend here where the use of the dollar becomes ever lower. Can something like a BRICS currency then take up some of that slack or that space? Moving then for you to geopolitical tensions and volatility between BRICS members, potentially. Firstly, we want to indicate for you the different attitudes towards China between BRICS and G7 countries. You can see the red bars indicate unfavorable and the orange bars favorable. Every country except South Africa then has favorable attitudes towards China in terms of the citizens who were surveyed by the Pew Research Center in 2023. You can see largely a lot of maybe uncertainty and skepticism towards the Chinese government, Chinese businesses, Chinese citizens across the board with G7 and BRICS countries. Of course, data not available from Russia for obvious reasons, so we're not sure how Russian citizens themselves feel about their relationship with the Chinese government, Chinese businesses, Chinese investment in Russia, which Russia has become very dependent on since its invasion of Ukraine last year. Can that particular relationship hold up to that strain as China continues to utilize raw Russian materials for its own economic growth and then in turn provides more investment in Russia itself? But this is a big challenge, I think, for BRICS coherence in terms of actual implementation of policy. Will citizens of these various countries go along with when their governments want to implement closer relations and potentially investment and diplomatic engagements with China? Another challenge then for BRICS in terms of geopolitics, but also in terms of basic values then. The average Freedom House score for BRICS, for the original BRICS, was 52 out of a score of 100. Your average Freedom House score for the BRICS Plus is 36. So quite a decline from that for the inclusion of the new members from the 1st of January next year. It can become trite sometimes talk about values like the rule of law, diplomacy, but many people in these various countries, these values are important to them in their daily lives. Perhaps if this trend continues of admitting countries with lower freedom scores in terms of economic freedom, individual freedom, civil liberties, respect for the rule of law, respect and allowance for different lifestyles, different sexual preferences, different issues around free speech. If that trend continues, will citizens in these various countries start to put more pressure on their governments to maybe not engage with those countries in an arrangement like BRICS, for example, or will those issues not be overriding in the long term? Is it purely going to be around pragmatic economic considerations? Where can we get investment? Where can we get investment in terms of job creation, business formation? We don't worry about the human rights issues. We just focus on the economics. Looking at regional frictions for you in terms of the BRICS plus, as it were, you've got Saudi Arabia as a US ally, continually so, the tensions potentially between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Russia and Iran, they may want to ally more closely with China against the more developed democracies, countries in the G7, but also then for countries like South Africa and Brazil, which lean more towards democratic freedoms. Are those then going to present tensions, more tensions between them and their BRICS partners? Brazil, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina likely have very little desire to become involved in yet more great power clashes, not to just be used as vassals or as means to an end. How are they going to navigate being part of a BRICS arrangement with a country like China, which is very much trying to challenge US influence around the world? Looking then at India, we'll look at both India and China, but just for India, likely to experience around 7% growth in 2023, massive opportunities there for India, to take the lead in terms of global economic growth, but also in terms of the influence of BRICS. India itself could boost the BRICS share of global GDP to more than 40% by 2040, compared to 32% last year. Hours before an Indian spacecraft landed on the moon's south pole recently, the Prime Minister Modi suggested the creation of a BRICS space consortium. Can India take the lead in terms of more focus on technology investment in the space of BRICS? And finally, you've got the G20 summit coming up on the 9th and 10th of September in Delhi. I think the G20 could be a more coherent and effective bloc than BRICS, because it also includes G7 countries, and it could then implement better policies in a more coherent manner in terms of both developed and developing economies. It can also bring more GDP power, more technological power to bear. But just a point on the geopolitical tensions, this G20 summit in Delhi, the president of China, Xi Jinping, he has declined to attend. So to highlight for you these potential tensions between BRICS members, not just in terms of border skirmishes between India and China, but in terms of India banning the use of Chinese tech in various spaces in India. Now the president of China choosing not to attend the G20 summit in India. The potential clash between India and China could very well render BRICS itself a sort of ineffective entity, as it were. Narrowing in a little bit on China, facing many economic challenges at the moment. South Africa's closer relationship with China could be one thing, but I don't know if it's the best bet purely pragmatically and economically in the long run. In China, consumer price inflation is negative. Exports and foreign direct investment are tanking. Evergrande has filed for bankruptcy, so their property market under a lot of pressure. And effectively, they have entered a deflationary recession. The last published figures for youth unemployment were published in July. Since then, the government has said they will not publish youth unemployment numbers. That was at 21%. We in South Africa would be very happy to only have 21% youth unemployment, but it points to the pressures currently on the Chinese government that they're opting not to publish youth unemployment figures going forward. Instead of, for example, renting one of the millions of empty new apartments that have been built with borrowed money by entities like Evergrande, young Chinese people are now living with their parents. This puts a lot of pressure on the Chinese government domestically. Are we going to see more protests, more unhappiness, as we saw last year in protests against the so-called zero COVID policy, China has many domestic challenges that it must now face. Summarizing for you then some of the BRICS challenges: a clear ideological and governance policy differences between some BRICS members. There is no charter, no secretariat, no established criteria for membership, and no procedures on expansion. And then finally, this clash again between India and China potentially. Moving on for you for a little bit of a focus on South Africa, the risks and opportunities as being part of BRICS. In terms of foreign policy, you had President Nelson Mandela, former President Nelson Mandela, on the eve of becoming president, he outlined South Africa's foreign policy at that time, the foreign policy approach, in an article in the journal Foreign Affairs. And I want to highlight, especially for you, issues of human rights are central to international relations. So the focus on democracy, on human rights, on promoting those values in terms of your country's foreign relations, your diplomatic engagements. I wonder whether we are seeing a shift right now towards foreign policy becoming more transactional, purely about what you get out in terms of investments, and you don't really necessarily focus on issues around values, values that are maybe too abstract or esoteric, where governments just want to focus on what can they get out of their relationship with each other. In his address before the latest BRICS Summit, President Ramaphosa placed a great importance, both in terms of values, in terms of democracy and the promotion of values, but also a lot of time focused on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, on job creation, on encouraging investment, on getting more capital into South Africa. So maybe the balance now, maybe the government is trying to strike a bit of a balance between the values on the one hand, but also the investment. But I think the incentive is becoming ever higher and higher to focus just on purely transactional economic choices. Also in the context of the pressure that is currently on the South African fiscus. Last week, we had new data from the Treasury. South Africa endured its largest budget deficit, monthly largest deficit since 2004. That places a lot of pressure on Treasury, on the Reserve Bank in terms of spending. Does the government want to put itself in a space more through relationships like it has in BRICS, where it can procure funding from the New Development Bank, for example, from China, to deal with the debt problems that are going to come down the road if government doesn't get a proper cap and a handle on its current spending trajectory? A little bit of focus then on this big deal that was announced leading up to the BRICS Summit between South Africa and China, a joint memorandum of understanding with 8 Chinese companies, the big focus on assistance regarding South Africa's energy and electricity crisis, trying to provide assistance there. So the idea is, at least on paper, that all public health facilities, schools, and police stations have alternative sources of energy. The deal is expected to bring between 300 to 450 backup electricity generation units. Just to give you an idea of that in the bigger context, there are over 23,000 public schools in South Africa. So the current amount of equipment that will hopefully be provided won't solve load shedding by any means. It could provide a stopgap in some regards, but I wish the focus was more on the sharing of skills, the sharing of technology, the sharing of experience to help Eskom bring at least some of the coal-fired power stations to a higher level of energy availability factor. As of last week, Eskom's energy availability factor, the amount of energy it has dispatchable, is lower than at this point it was last year. So we're likely to enter a period of more intense load shedding for the short to medium term, at least Eskom relying heavily on the open cycle gas turbines, using a lot of diesel. For that, perhaps part of the deal with the Chinese companies involves funding for more diesel, also securing alternative sources for diesel, but none of that solves load shedding in the longer term. It doesn't ensure that the coal fleet is placed on a better footing. It doesn't ensure that, for example, the coal fleet can perform better. Hopefully, we'll see some better agreements here in terms of renewable energy sharing, the technology of that. You've had issues around the imports of solar panels into South Africa, up to the point where local manufacturing can't keep up, but also the government hasn't really created that enabling environment for local manufacturing to take place. So we're very reliant on imports of solar panels to help us deal with the intense load shedding that we've had up until this point? Can South Africa get some of its own local policies in order that we aren't that over-reliant on imports from countries like China? Just in terms of South Africa's policy choices in the context then of BRICS, we have progressively slid from a high of 32nd on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index to our current position of 84th. The 2022 Simon Fraser Mining Investment Attractiveness Index ranks South Africa as 57th least attractive jurisdiction for mining investment, below countries like the DRC, Papua New Guinea, and Tanzania. We're in the context of weaker global demand for our minerals. That means less revenue for the South African state. The areas then of logistics, crime, and energy, big focus for the South African government, also for bigger businesses in South Africa. There shouldn't be a presumption that because we are part of BRICS and because we will now be part of an expanded BRICS, that our own policy choices are not vitally important, that we don't need to get these things right to put us on a better growth path, to ensure that more South Africans experience the benefits of economic growth, of an improvement in living standards, and improvement in terms of job opportunities. Being part of BRICS does not cure our own domestic policy choices and our current domestic policy blocks that prevent economic growth bigger than, for example, 0.5%, which in the context of a growing population especially will simply do nothing to address the over 40% unemployment rate on the expanded definition. So South Africa has done well up until recently, hosting the successful BRICS Summit. You can say in terms of burnishing the president's reputation, for example, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we then locally, that everything, that all the challenges that we face are solved overnight. There is a lot of hard work to be done in that regard. It's one thing to say you're part of BRICS, you're now part of a multipolar world, all these sort of buzzwords, but the hard work of policy reform has to be done in South Africa for us both to figure things out locally, but also then to be a more important role player in the wider BRICS alliance or BRICS association. The issue of corruption, also another important one to solve domestically, and then the issue of low growth and investment, and finally your challenge of job creation. Perhaps something like BRICS could facilitate better trade agreements, but you don't need BRICS to facilitate your trade agreements. We do not even have a bilateral trade agreement with China, but we benefit very much from our trade with China in terms of our exports, and then also in terms of importing more manufactured goods. You want that relationship to turn around, but South Africa is not going to export more manufactured goods if we don't get our electricity situation right. Again, the burden there and the opportunity on government to reform its focus areas in terms of electricity generation. We come then to our final section, our key takeaways and our scenarios. Finally, globally, in our view, as we have highlighted in many of our risk alerts throughout this year, high inflation, high interest rates, capital not flowing as much as it did before the COVID-19 pandemic. We have entered a global risk-off sentiment. Capital wants returns on investment, as does any business. If a country like South Africa has a higher risk premium, investment will not flow here. How do we navigate this global risk-off environment? If the BRICS arrangement means we implement policies that are more pro-economic growth, then possibly we can attract that sort of capital that we need for more job creation, more business formation. You could now enter the period of omnidirectional foreign policies. So it's not just the case of if a country is part of BRICS or if it is part of the G20 or part of the United Nations, that you can predict its foreign policy at every single opportunity, especially not in the South African case, as we now head towards an election next year, maybe more pragmatic foreign policy considerations. But it's big, maybe especially for more developed countries in the G7, they are going to need to adopt perhaps more nuanced approaches to their foreign policy engagements with the members of BRICS, who do not necessarily want themselves to be defined in terms of that one block, as it were. It's not going to lend itself to easily predictability, as it were. You could have now the overriding sense of more pragmatism than ideology. So it's not just determination of a country adhering to certain values, and that means it will act accordingly, but we could now enter a period where the focus is more on purely short-term pragmatic economic and investment policies. There's all this talk of multipolarity, but the risk for BRICS especially is that it could it could become a talk shop for the pure extension of Chinese influence, and we could still be entrenched in a bipolar world, with the one bloc being the US and the other bloc being China. Some more of our key takeaways then: the Chinese slowdown exerting a lot of pressure on China itself, but also on its BRICS partners. South Africa heavily reliant on China for our exports in terms of raw materials. Should China now enter a period of stagnation, where does South Africa find opportunities to export our raw materials? The expanded BRICS could dilute South African influence even further than we have been up until this point. You have new kinds of extractive colonialism, where more developed economies in BRICS rely on the less developed countries purely for raw materials, and then they import manufactured goods into those countries. Do those less developed BRICS partners really want to fulfill that role only? The sort of radically anti-Western rhetoric that we've seen, at least from some BRICS members, could suit only China and Russia, not South Africa, India, and Brazil. And it will also not suit the new members who, again, need the sharing of skills, technology, investment, better trade relationships, both with G7 countries, but also with BRICS countries and G20 countries. It's not going to do for those countries that want to experience more economic growth, better quality of life, if BRICS only becomes a talking point around extending Chinese influence, for example. South Africa's BRICS membership could be an opportunity to expand underdeveloped trade ties. Can we have that sort of singular focus to ensure that we've got better economic trade relationships? But also, can we get, again, some of our domestic trade issues right, where our railways work, our ports work, where we could take the lead in something like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, where South Africa benefits from that extension of trade, both in terms of the rest of Africa, but also in terms of our relationship with our BRICS partners. The sharing of knowledge, technology, and intellectual property, the potential for transfer arrangements, that could be a very good focus for BRICS going forward. And finally, in terms of domestic policy and the elections, the successful hosting of the summit, and also now the inclusion of new members, could burnish President Ramaphosa's reputation and standing locally and internationally in the context of the 2024 election. President Ramaphosa is still the strongest selling point for the ANC in terms of voting. So now that the summit has been hosted, BRICS has been expanded, you will likely see a bigger focus from the ANC in terms of punting its successes in that regard in an attempt to drum up more support before the elections next year. For all the talk of the Global South, this idea of the Global South, inclusion, multipolarity, I just want to bring us a little bit back down to earth, away from the buzzwords, and the focus on something that happened recently in the sub-Saharan African region, the elections in Zimbabwe, where President Ramaphosa said South Africa congratulates the government and the people of Zimbabwe for organizing and holding harmonized elections for its executive, national, and local government. South Africa has taken note of the preliminary pronouncements by the invited international observers missions and calls on all the parties in Zim to work in unison and in sustaining peace. So you've got the talk of the Global South, of inclusion, of multipolarity, but despite the concerns around the election that took place, around interference, around intimidation, the South African government still takes the stance of, we congratulate the government on the election, and indeed President Ramaphosa will attend the inauguration of President Mnangagwa. So for all the talk of, we want to use BRICS to promote democracy, we want the world to be more inclusive, at the first port of opportunity in terms of its own backyard, South Africa maybe only pays lip service to the values of democracy, of inclusion, of the rule of law. And I worry that BRICS could very much follow that sort of line, where we've got the talking points and the good that could come from it, but the governments and the countries that form part of BRICS do not implement the steps necessary to ensure that those values are lived out, as it were. Finally, our scenarios for you. Firstly, we could have BRICS becoming a more productive, focused entity. Maybe you will have agreements in terms of who will be let in and who won't be, what are the requirements, what do those countries that form part of BRICS need to deliver for BRICS to be a more effective entity? Can they focus on certain issues, maybe around energy, around climate change, certain technological sharing points, like I mentioned, some of those trade agreements and skill sharing arrangements. If the BRICS Plus can drill down to some priorities over the short to medium to long term, hold countries to account for those, realize where they can implement local reforms, maybe implement a few studies and focus points, then you could see the BRICS entity not just being a talk shop, but becoming more productive in the positive sense, not just becoming a sort of useful negotiating point for China, but where each country still pursues its own interests, and in terms of the BRICS arrangement as a whole, can also take active engagement and roles in both diplomacy, but also in terms of economics. Your second scenario, it could largely be a talk shop. Entities like the New Development Bank maybe are not as active as they could be. The summit meets regularly. You've got, again, the buzzwords thrown around, but nothing much of substance happens. So you don't have the countries that form part of BRICS really growing their share of global GDP. You don't have them growing their share of global influence. But it becomes just a case of we continue to add new members, but it's more a case of it helps us to feel good versus we implement actionable, real plans. And then finally, our final scenario, it could become a more destructive or at least non-effective entity. Maybe the case where countries that form part of BRICS actively engage in military operations, in more antagonistic relations and stances towards other countries like the US, where it doesn't benefit those countries within BRICS and also doesn't benefit the world as a whole. That is another potential scenario into which BRICS could emerge as we go forward. I'll end on that note. Thank you very much for your time, for your attention, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just quickly going to jump in here for a second to, first of all, thank you wholeheartedly for that insight, and which surely would have added a bit of perspective from what came out of these few days of the BRICS Summit, and also cutting through the noise of the media and understanding better the reports. I would really like to encourage our audience to write any questions you might have into the chat box, please. We have, I believe, Makone from the CRA. She will be assisting as well with the Q&A facilitation, but of course I couldn't resist the opportunity to jump in first and put my question there, Chris, because you know I always ponder on these energy solutions that were addressed during the BRICS Summit and how wonderful it all sounds, and my ears just ring when I see these astronomical amounts that South Africa is committing to, and a grant which China so gracefully has handed out to South Africa to facilitate some of the these agreements, but then the loans, which really I find quite eye-watering. So while the others are typing away, hopefully, maybe you can give a little bit of insight on what you think China really does expect in return from South Africa by pumping so much into our infrastructure and in particular energy. Surely there is more to it than just, you know, neighborly love between the two countries. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Eve. Yeah, we could be proven wrong in this regard, but if one uses the trend of Chinese investment in various countries up until this point, in things like infrastructure, energy, water articulation, that sort of thing, the expectation is of some sort of special economic zone in terms of more engagement and buying of Chinese products, allowing space for Chinese businesses to operate, for Chinese citizens, for the movement to be more easily facilitated. So that could be part of this agreement from the Chinese side in the longer run. Given the economic difficulties that China is encountering now, there could be an expectation and a more pressure placed on South Africa to buy more Chinese goods in the future to help stimulate Chinese economic activity, job creation, that sort of thing. There could be allowance and the relaxing of certain legislative requirements. You had a clear request from a few Chinese businesses in terms of the relaxing of BEE rules in South Africa, where we want to invest here, so maybe change some of your labor laws or at least exempt us or something like that. That could be another concession in that regard, where other governments, countries, businesses are held to different standards then. So it's a sort of, yeah, take your pick kind of thing, a cheese platter, as it were, of policies in terms of labor law. If you're from a certain country, you get a certain benefit and a certain relaxation of those. The worst case scenario is, despite the promise or the idea of no strings attached, according to the Minister of Electricity, where maybe when the equipment has run its sort of run out of life, as it were, then it becomes the case of, well, either you give it back to us or you give us equipment that can replace it on a similar level that we can then use. We have to use the equipment. We need the resources. Provide us with what you have that at least works so that we can use it then in our own facilities, as it were. I don't think that's going to be the case, because it's sort of different standards, as it were, in terms of equipment, operational ability and that kind of thing. I don't think that's going to be the case. And I also don't know if it'll be the case, worst case, that you have maybe the building of a port, and then at some point, if the investment that went into that port, if you can't repay that, then China effectively runs that port, because the focus here is on specific equipment to generate electricity. So generators, for example, solar panels, more minute pieces of equipment, not necessarily big infrastructure projects, roads, ports, that kind of thing. Hopefully we'll get more details in that regard. But for now, it does seem to me a bit of a stopgap measure and just short-term assistance, and not necessarily the case where China will come and demand, I don't know, a share of GDP or more, or bigger requirements, as it were. That doesn't mean that we can't see different arrangements in the future where perhaps those concessions are demanded, especially if China has to take on more risk in terms of investing in South Africa, as do many companies around the world now. South Africa's risk premium has increased with time. So perhaps they will want better concessions or requirements from the South African government side. But for now, I think China has realized an opportunity where South Africa has been caught a bit between Russia and the US, maybe with Russia docking the Lady R in Simonstown. They wanted to push South Africa into a bit of a corner where South Africa now had to engage in this panel of inquiry and once and for all try and show this is what was loaded, this is unloaded, as we heard yesterday from President Ramaphosa. So I think this was a longer term game maybe that China wants to play, where it assists South Africa in the short term and then gets more preferential policies over the medium to long term.
Time will tell. Thank you so much for that, Chris. Dear audience, dear guests, please feel free. Here's your chance to pop a question. In actual fact, we don't have any written questions, so I wonder if we shouldn't also if you want to ask a question, raise your hand and then we can unmute you. That might work, considering we don't have any other written questions to attend to. If anybody has anything they want to ask. I'm not missing anybody, am I? Unless you just unmute and ask. We might not be able to see any raised hands with the numbers. You've covered it so well, Chris. Everybody is completely up to date. Oh, there we go. Hi, Chris. Do you see any? I'm assuming that means timeline to
Timeline.
Timeline. Johan, maybe do you just want to unmute yourself and ask what you would like to know?
If it is around the time. Oh, there we go. Hi, Johan,
Chris, can you hear me?
We can now.
Okay, it's just a simple question, and I think based back onto our experience in terms of our ability to implement in South Africa and also some of the BRICS countries, do you foresee any specific timeline at this point in time until we actually arrive at the potential BRICS Plus?
Yeah, so at least nominally, thanks, Johan. At least nominally, countries, the countries who have now been invited, they will be part of BRICS Plus on the 1st of January next year. The bigger risk, I think, and the bigger issue becomes, where are they going to be in terms of trade agreements, in terms of investment agreements, in terms of policy, concrete policy. That timeline can be as wide as you might expect or might want or might feel comfortable with. Yeah, I mean, my easiest analogy is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is for all intents and purposes operational at this point in time, but that doesn't mean that trade yet. There has been some trade between some African countries as part of the AFCFTA, but it hasn't been fully implemented to where we want the lowering of trade barriers, for example. So you're going to get the new members formally joining BRICS on the 1st of January next year, but they will attend the future summits, all that kind of thing. But in terms of when they come up with new agreements and new timelines for actual projects, for the new development bank to increase the number of trades that happen between local currencies, we do not yet have any indication in that regard. And I think that is going to be in the medium to long term, especially because of the operational challenges where BRICS doesn't have a secretariat, doesn't have these sort of formal institutional bodies, as it were, that you might need to keep the summit, to keep the entity going between summits, for example. I'm skeptical in terms of the actual operationality of BRICS.
Thanks, Chris. Johan, I hope that answered your question. If not, just pop a follow-up question to that. We have a question from Godfrey Tekiso. What benefits and challenges has South Africa reaped and faced respectively since joining BRICS?
The easiest is probably the challenges, thanks, Godfrey, where the presumption has been we are part of this new global entity, and that means our global influence will extend, countries will benefit, South Africa will benefit economically, but that hasn't necessarily been the reality. So, for example, we haven't had to be part of BRICS to trade with China. We run a trade deficit with China. We export lots of raw materials and we import manufactured goods. That has simply happened regardless of BRICS. So we've got the challenge where we're part of this body, but we don't necessarily use it, number one, to extend our influence globally or to push for policies that might benefit us in terms of bilateral trade agreements. Maybe it's sort of that idea of you're fooled by the promise of the entity, of the idea, but then the actual implementation doesn't follow necessarily. So I think that's a continued challenge where we don't just focus on the rhetoric, but we hold the government then to those agreements that are part of BRICS, to those requirements that are part of BRICS, that we use it in a positive sense to improve economic growth and the quality of the standard of life in South Africa. In terms of the benefits, I think it has somewhat burnished South Africa's reputation that had declined a little bit since sort of 2000, maybe 2010, especially under the Zuma administration. Being part of BRICS could have provided South Africa with a different platform to voice its issues, its ideas on a global platform where we might not have enjoyed that because we wouldn't be part of something like the G7, for example. Also, in terms of benefits, it provides a country like South Africa that is sort of still part of the developing idea, if you still want to use those terms. It provides you with a place to push for policies that might benefit you more. I don't think we've used it to our full advantage, but it does give you that sort of platform. In terms of an expanded BRICS now, the sort of BRICS Plus, can we continue to make our voice heard, not just in a pragmatic sense or a case-by-case sense, where in the spur of the moment, BRICS comes together, an event happens somewhere in the world, you've got the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then we say something, then we act. But that we come to certain values, certain priorities, certain plans over the medium to long term that we're going to focus on to the benefit of our member countries. South Africa, I think, could take the lead, not the lead, but could push very strongly in that regard if we utilize it appropriately. I don't know if we currently have the diplomatic and the administrative skills in the current administration to do that sort of thing, but the potential is very much there. And you could see more movement in that regard after the elections next year. It might not happen now. The focus now is going to be on the elections, on domestic issues. Yesterday, with the President Ramaphosa's address, of course, the feedback from the BRICS Summit and also the feedback in terms of the Lady R investigation, that will be used in the context of, look how well our administration did to host the BRICS Summit, reward us with your vote in the elections next year. It'll all now be focused on domestic issues, I think. And then maybe we'll get another focus on BRICS Plus in 2025, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. If anybody else has anything to ask, if not, we're not missing anybody wanting to pose any further questions, then I think I will wrap up. We're spot on an hour. Chris and your team, thank you so much once again for your insightful presentation and your commentary. Brilliant as always. Thank you to our listeners for joining us for this. I hope it provided some clarity on what lies ahead for our country. Please do feel free to get in touch with us if you want more information, or with the CRA directly, of course, whom you all know. I will be sending out a link once we've uploaded the video. I'll send the link to everybody who's been here. And all that remains for me is to say a big thank you to you, Chris, and to everybody else. I wish you all the best for the week ahead. Stay happy and healthy, and until next time. Thank you. Bye.